Thursday was Thanksgiving, and I thought it'd be interesting to talk a little about Thanksgiving this morning. What we usually think about Thanksgiving is the Pilgrims. The Pilgrims came over in 1620 on the Mayflower, and they had some hard times that first year, but by the second year things were going better, and so they had a feast to celebrate. And according to the Smithsonian Institution, that did indeed happen in the year 1621. But there's some background to that. The Pilgrims were Puritans, and the Puritans were a religious group in England that was a sect of Calvinism. And that means that they followed the thoughts of a man named John Calvin. And John Calvin was the most influential figure of the Protestant Reformation. And the Calvinists became very powerful in England for a while, and they took over the Church of England. It's known as the Anglican Church. In the United States, you would know it as the Episcopal Church. And for a while, they even overthrew the King of England and took over Parliament. And so for a while, Calvinists ruled in England. It wasn't just, the Calvinists never were satisfied with just having a church. They wanted to rule the whole society. And they did that in England for a while. Now, one of the things that Calvinists did not like were Catholics. And they did not like Catholics because, for many, many reasons. But one of the reasons they didn't like Catholics is because Catholics had a lot of religious holidays. And Calvinists did not believe in religious holidays. They thought the only religious day should be Sunday, and the only thing you should do on Sunday was have a regular church service. They didn't believe in doing any kind of special days in church. And the Church of England had broken away from the Catholic Church many years before and become independent, but it still retained all those Catholic holidays, and the Calvinists did not like that. And so when they gained political power in England, they abolished all religious holidays, even Christmas and Easter. They actually passed laws banning Christmas and Easter. All they believed in doing was having a regular church service on Sunday, and that's all. If Christmas happened to fall on a Sunday, they didn't even mention it in church. It was just a regular Sunday. Now, although Calvinists did not believe in celebrating religious holidays, they did have two special observances that were very important to them, and they never really regarded these as religious holidays. And they didn't do anything in church relative to these. It was an entirely secular thing outside of church, but they both had to do with religion. And one of these was called their days of fasting. Now, what are days of fasting? Well, when you hear Calvinist, the first thing you might think of is predestination. The belief that God chooses who goes to heaven and God chooses who goes to hell. And of course, Calvinists did believe that, do believe that God chooses who goes to heaven and hell. But that was not their main belief. That belief just resulted in a belief that was their overarching belief. The overarching belief of Calvinism is that God controls everything that happens. Absolutely everything. Everything happens because God makes it happen. Nothing happens that God does not make happen. Nothing whatsoever. So you can see how that would also indicate that God chooses who goes to heaven and hell, because God controls everything. So God controls your eternal destiny, whether you'll end up in heaven or hell. But God also decides every single thing that will happen in your life. God decides everything that will happen to everyone. God decides everything that happens in the entire world, even down to the minutest detail. Even whether you see an ant crawling across the cement when you leave, God controlled that. Now, according to the Calvinists, the major factor that God uses to decide what happens is that God gives everyone exactly what they deserve. God gives tit for tat. God pays you back good with good and bad with bad. God sends good things on people who please Him and bad things on people who displease Him. And so, if something bad happened to you, that must mean that you had done something that displeased God. And that's where the days of fasting came from. Let's say something bad happened in society. Maybe there was a bad storm and tore everything up. Or maybe there was a drought this summer. Or an outbreak of some kind of disease. Now, Calvinists would conclude that that happened because the people were not pleasing God. And that's why God had brought that stuff on. Because remember, God repays tit for tat. You hit me, I hit you 10 times. And God controls everything. That includes every drop of rain, every hurricane or tornado, and every sickness. If you got sick, the Calvinists would say you got sick because you had sinned and God was getting back at you. If there was an outbreak of sickness among the people, they would say that the people were sinning and displeasing God, and God was punishing them. And so if something bad happened, days of fasting were proclaimed, and these usually lasted for 3 days. And during that time, people were to fast, think about all the ways they had sinned. They were supposed to turn from those sins and resolve to do better, determine not to live that way anymore. And then hopefully God would not continue to direct His anger toward the people. Hopefully no more bad things would happen. Now, of course, in our day, as you can imagine, Calvinists would have proclaimed days of fasting for the coronavirus. They would have been sure that God sent the virus as punishment for sin, as punishment for evil in the world and evil within society, and they would have proclaimed days of fasting, and then maybe, just maybe, God would take it away when His anger was satiated. On the other hand, though, if good things happened to you, if you had good weather, the crops were good and had a good harvest, things were going the people's way, then it must mean that the people had pleased God. They were living lives that God approved of. Now see, here we go back to that overriding belief that God controls everything. And God does that by giving you what you deserve. And so if things are going well for you, that must mean that you have pleased God and God is rewarding you. And so if things were going especially well for the people, they would assume God was pleased with them and was rewarding them, and so they would give themselves a reward. They would proclaim days of thanksgiving. And again, these usually lasted 3 days. And during that time, people would eat a lot, they would engage in recreation, and even in excessive drinking. Remember, it wasn't Calvinists that came up with the idea that drinking was wrong. That was the Baptists. It wasn't Calvinists. So it was a big celebration. But remember, to the Calvinists, these were not religious observances at all. They were secular observances. And none of this stuff happened in church. It was done for religious reasons, but it never was in church. That's where the idea of Thanksgiving came from, though, to the Pilgrims who had it in 1621. Now, there were other Pilgrims, or other Puritans, in the United States, in the continent of America, and they were Calvinists, and there were also other Calvinists in this country that were not Puritans, and especially in the early days of the settlement of this country, most all of the people who settled here were Calvinists of one stripe or another. And that led to them having days of fasting and days of thanksgiving a lot. The one we associate with Thanksgiving was held in 1621, but there had been others. We know that there was one in Maine in 1607, There was also one in Jamestown in that year. Jamestown had another one in 1610. And there were likely many more that never made it into the historical record. And the ones that the Pilgrims had were not the first Thanksgiving. It was just the one that got the most publicized. And they had a much bigger one in the year 1623. And so these days of Thanksgiving were held sporadically in many different places in colonial times. They were not associated with any specific calendar day. They were held whenever it was felt that things were going so well that people deserved days of Thanksgiving. Now, one of the hymns that we heard coming in this morning was the hymn called "We Gather Together." We gather together to ask the Lord's blessing. He chastens and hastens his will to make known. And what that means is he punishes or rewards in order to make you know God's will. In other words, if things start going bad for you, you will know that you are following a way God does not want you to go, and so you'll turn and go a different way. If things are going well in your life, you'll know that God is pleased with you and you keep going in that direction. So God makes his will known to you by making you sick or giving you hard times if you're on the wrong path, and by giving you blessings if you're on the right path. And that is sort of the way God guides you. He chastens and hastens his will to make known. And that is reflected in that hymn that is often sung at Thanksgiving. Now, in the year 1788, the United States Constitution was ratified by the last state, and in the next year, Congress approved a resolution for an official day of Thanksgiving to give thanks for the Constitution. And President George Washington set that date for Thursday, November the 26th, 1789. That was the first official Thanksgiving in the United States, and it was a one-time thing proclaimed especially to give thanks for the Constitution. Now, of course, this was not the same as the old Calvinist days of Thanksgiving, but it was a similar idea. And after that, various presidents would occasionally proclaim a day of Thanksgiving for one reason or another. In 1863, after the Union forces were victorious at the Battle of Gettysburg, Abraham Lincoln proclaimed a day of Thanksgiving for the fourth Thursday in November to be repeated every year to commemorate the victory of the Union forces at the Battle of Gettysburg. Now, during the late 1930s, President Franklin Roosevelt changed it to the third Thursday, and there were so many people that got mad about that finally in 1941, Congress made it official. The fourth Thursday in November became a fixed law of the land to have a national day of general Thanksgiving. And so by and large, Thanksgiving in the United States was a secular holiday. It was never meant to be a religious holiday in our country. It is only in recent years that churches began observing it. Today, many churches still don't ever mention Thanksgiving, or some of them will observe it only in passing. But as I said, it was never really intended as a religious holiday. The Puritans obviously didn't consider it to be a religious holiday, although they did it for religious reasons. And it came to be a holiday in the United States, not in a religious sense, but purely in a secular sense. However, the origin of the proclaiming days of Thanksgiving does seem to have originated with the Calvinists, and it originated because of the belief that God controls everything, and it was a dual thing. If things are going bad for you, God is not pleased and he's punishing you, so you need to have days of fasting to get God to take away whatever bad is happening. If things are going well for you, God is pleased with you and is rewarding you, so you deserve days of Thanksgiving. So that's the reasoning behind how Thanksgiving first started. It did not start as a religious holiday. It started as a secular thing, but it has gradually found its way into churches over the years. It has always made me uncomfortable to think of Thanksgiving in a religious sense. I do not believe God controls everything, and I do not believe God operates by giving people what they deserve. Now, it may sound weird coming from me, since I am a minister, but it's always made me uncomfortable to do a blessing before a meal. I have never liked to do that. If you come to our house, you won't hear one, because we don't do it. And I have never liked to do that for one reason. There are a lot of hungry people in the world that don't have enough to eat. There are a lot of hungry people in Cleveland County. If I thank God for my food, for giving me my food, then it's like I'm saying I have food because God gave it to me. And the reasoning for saying a blessing before a meal, I guess, or the way I've heard it, is that God, we thank you for this food. Well, that's just great. But what about the people who don't have it? I cannot believe the hungry people in the world are hungry because God has either withheld food from them or neglected to give it to them. I just do not believe that. I'm sorry. And so I do not say thank you, God, for giving me this food, because there are people who live not far from us in Bellwood that I know don't have enough to eat. And so I just can't say that. I'm sorry. You know, the Bible does tell us, though, to give thanks to God. Many of the Psalms have that thing. We've used one of those today. And there are many things to thank God for. But if I make a point of saying to God, God, I thank you that I have food to eat, and I have clothes to wear. When I got up this morning, turned up the heat, we can pay the bill to run it, and we can have a warm house to get ready, and we have a nice place to live, and we have good health and all. If I go down the list thanking God for all that, then really I'm saying the same thing the Calvinists said, that God controls everything. And if I do that, it's then easy to fall into the trap of thinking, well, then the way God controls everything is he gives people what they deserve. The people who have good lives and lots of stuff are living good lives, and they're rewarded. And the people who are poor or people who are not in good health are being punished by God. So, seen in that way, Thanksgiving can lead to a lot of questions. If you look up the word thankful in the dictionary, you'll see it has several definitions. One of them is it is grateful about something in the sense that you are grateful for someone for doing something or giving you something. Someone did something to you and you are thankful. You are grateful for it. Now, if we attach that meaning to Thanksgiving, that we are grateful to God that we have enough food, that we have clothes, that we have good health, then it leads to thinking that people who don't have that, God has either withheld that from them or neglected to give it to them. And that's something I just can't believe. But there's another meaning for the word thankful. It can also mean that you are glad or pleased about something. You're just glad or pleased about something. And that's how I look at Thanksgiving. We are pleased and glad that our lives are the way they are. We are pleased and glad that we don't live in some third world country. We are pleased and glad that we have food to eat and a place to live and clothes to wear. We are pleased and glad that we have family and friends. We are pleased and glad about any number of things. You see, if we look at it that way, we're not making statements about God giving it to me, but didn't give it to the guy that lives a mile from me. We don't get mired in the conundrum of thinking God controls everything and gives some people food but lets others starve, and gives some people good health by causing somebody else to have a heart attack at age 35. I was in junior high school when the Vietnam War was winding down, and in some class, I can't remember what it was, that was history, geography or something, we were learning about Southeast Asia. countries like Vietnam and Cambodia and Laos. And really bad things were going on in those places back then. They probably still are. You just don't hear about it. And the people that lived in those places lived under horrible conditions, and they had horrible lives. And I remember how that haunted me. I was in junior high school. And I can remember lying in bed at night thinking how horrible it would be to live in a place like that. I mean, you just think about it. To live like in Laos or Cambodia, somewhere like that. And even way back then, when I was barely a teenager, I thought about something. It dawned on me that I could have been born in a place like that. I could very well have been born in a place like that. But I wasn't. But what if I had been? And really when I was back there, I used to lay in bed and I'd think about what in the world if I had been born somewhere like that. Now even back then I didn't go so far as to thank God I wasn't born there. But I'm still glad I wasn't born there. I'm glad I wasn't born into a lot of situations that exist here in the United States. I could have been born into a ghetto in New York City or somewhere. I'm fortunate to be able to walk out the door of my house and have all that open space. There's nobody around us, thank goodness. And we were really glad about where we lived last year when all the rioting and all that mess was going on. I'm glad I don't live somewhere like Los Angeles or San Francisco or Brooklyn or Chicago or somewhere like that. I'm glad I don't live in a lot of neighborhoods here in Shelby. And I am thankful for my life. I'm not saying I'm good and God rewarded me for being good by giving me a good life and good health. I don't believe that I'm in the situation I'm in because I deserve it. And the people laying there in the hospital right now are over there because they deserve it. I don't believe that one bit. But I am very glad that my life turned out the way it did. I don't want to go any farther than that, though. I'm happy about it, and I'm glad about it, and I really, really appreciate it. So maybe this is a different way of thinking about Thanksgiving, but I'd encourage you to at least think about it. To look at Thanksgiving as a time to be glad and pleased and happy about the things that are right in our life. You know, a lot of people spend so much time thinking about the things that are wrong in the world, or the things that are wrong in their lives, or the way they're unsatisfied. Sometimes we can get consumed by thinking about that stuff to the point where that controls us. But maybe Thanksgiving can be a time when we can wait and say, wait a minute. Look at all these things in my life that I have to be happy about. You become what you think. And if you continually think and concentrate on the bad or the things that are wrong, you become consumed about that. Maybe we need to spend more time being glad about the things that are right. Be glad about the things that are right. That doesn't mean to ignore the things that are wrong. But we've got to balance thinking about the things that are wrong with thinking about the things that are right. So hopefully that way of looking at Thanksgiving can help us do that.